Power has a
Here is the
sound.
menu for you, sir.
Sometimes it's the
Thank you very
soft
much.
clink of
This
crystal
looks
glasses under a
wonderful.
chandelier.
Indeed, quite impressive.
Sometimes it's the low murmur of men who've never been told no. And sometimes it's a language spoken just quietly enough to exclude. Daniel Moreau understood power better than most. A billionaire by 40, polished by elite schools and private rooms where accents mattered more than character, he believed he could read a person's worth in seconds. The suit you wore, the way you stood, the role you played. That night, at one of the city's most exclusive restaurants, Daniel felt completely at home. Surrounded by admirers, warmed by expensive wine, he did what powerful men often do when they think no one's listening. He spoke freely. When the waitress approached, calm, professional, unremarkable in the way society prefers its service workers to be, Daniel switched languages. French, smooth, elegant, private. Or so he thought. To him, it was harmless. A joke, a reminder of who belonged at the table and who didn't. But what Daniel didn't know, what he couldn't see past the uniform and the assumptions, was that language cuts both ways. And sometimes the person you're speaking over is understanding every single word. That was the moment everything changed. Daniel Moreau didn't just dine, he performed. The crystal chandeliers of Le Jardin Élégant cast golden light across white linen tablecloths as he leaned back in his chair, swirling a $400 Bordeaux. Around him sat his usual audience, Jeff, a tech executive who laughed too loud at every joke, Becky, dripping in diamonds she didn't buy herself, and Grace, quiet, always watching. Another flawless quarter, Jeff said, raising his glass. You're untouchable, Daniel. Daniel smiled, the kind that never reached his eyes. It's about knowing which rooms to be in, and which people don't belong in them. That's when Amara appeared. She moved through the dining room with practiced efficiency, her posture straight, her expression calm. Professional, invisible, the way people like Daniel preferred their help to be. Your appetizers, she said, placing plates with precision. Daniel barely glanced at her, but as she turned to leave, he leaned toward Jeff, his voice dropping into smooth, fluid French. Regarde-la. Elle pense qu'elle appartient ici. Look at her. She thinks she belongs here. Becky giggled behind her wine glass. Jeff smirked, shaking his head. Daniel's eyes glittered with satisfaction as he continued, his French flowing faster now, more casual, more cruel. C'est toujours pareil avec ces gens-là. Ils servent, mais ils ne comprennent jamais vraiment leur place. It's always the same with these people. They serve, but they never truly understand their place. He lifted his glass, savoring both the wine and the moment, the delicious privacy of speaking a language he assumed she couldn't possibly understand. Across the room, Amara paused. Her hand rested briefly on an empty table. Then, without turning around, she smiled. Daniel believed language was power. He had no idea what was about to happen next. Amara's pen never stopped moving. She stood 3 feet away, writing down the wine order as Daniel's words slithered through the air between them. Her face remained perfectly still, no flinch, no flicker, nothing, but her pulse knew. Le service ici devient vraiment médiocre, Daniel continued, louder now, feeding off Becky's delighted gasp. On laisse entrer n'importe qui ces jours-ci. The service here is getting really mediocre. They let just anybody in these days. Jeff leaned in, grinning. You're terrible. I'm honest, Daniel corrected, his French flowing faster, sharper. Ces gens pensent qu'un uniforme les rend égaux. Pathétique. These people think a uniform makes them equal. Pathetic. Becky covered her mouth, shoulders shaking with laughter. Amara clicked her pen closed. Slowly, deliberately, she turned slightly, not toward them but away, as if she hadn't heard a thing. As if she was simply doing her job, invisible and insignificant, exactly as they expected. Daniel watched her walk away, satisfaction spreading across his face like warm butter. Perfect, he murmured. To Daniel, French wasn't just a language. It was a wall, a velvet rope, a way to separate the world into those who understood and those who served. He'd learned it young, in boarding schools where accents determined your worth, in boardrooms where a flawless Parisian phrase could close a deal before numbers ever could. Language was power, uniforms were armor, and assumptions, they were weapons. He raised his glass again, triumph glinting in his eyes. Across the room, Amara set down her notepad at the server station. She smoothed her apron. Then she picked up the dessert menu, the one printed entirely in French, and turned back toward table 7. Her smile was silk over steel. Daniel had no idea he'd just made the worst mistake of his life. Daniel was just getting started. When Amara returned with the wine, he didn't even look up. Instead, he pointed lazily at the menu, mangling the French pronunciation with theatrical exaggeration. "We'll have the tartare de bœuf?" He dragged out the syllables like they were covered in mud, then glanced at Jeff. "Penses-tu qu'elle sait même ce que c'est? Do you think she even knows what that is?" Jeff snorted into his napkin. Amara's hand remained steady as she poured. "Of course, sir. The beef tartare. Excellent choice." Daniel's eyes narrowed, just slightly. He didn't like that her voice hadn't wavered. So he pushed harder. "Je parie qu'elle ne sait même pas compter jusqu'à 100, he said, smirking at Jeff. "Regarde ses mains trembler quand elle calcule l'addition. I bet she can't even count to 100. Watch her hands shake when she calculates the bill." Becky giggled again, covering her mouth with perfectly manicured fingers. Grace shifted uncomfortably, her eyes dropping to her plate. But she said nothing. Daniel leaned back, emboldened by the silence, by the laughter, by the certainty that he was untouchable. He looked directly at Amara now, his smile slow and venomous. "Did you get all that?" he asked in English, each word dripping with condescension, or should I say it, slower? The table erupted. Jeff slapped the table. Becky dabbed tears from her eyes. Even the couple at the next table glanced over, confused but amused by the energy. Amara stood perfectly still. She met Daniel's eyes for exactly 3 seconds, long enough to let him think he'd won. Then she nodded once, professionally. "I got it, sir." She turned toward the kitchen, her posture unchanged, her expression unreadable, but her fingers brushed the edge of her apron pocket where a small notebook rested. And inside that notebook, written in flawless French, was every single word he'd said. Amara returned with the tartare. She set it down gently, her movements unhurried, unbothered. Daniel was mid-sentence, spinning another joke in French for Jeff's benefit, when she straightened and spoke. "Pardonnez-moi, monsieur," she said, her voice soft but crystalline. "Je crois que vous vouliez dire pathétique au pluriel, n'est-ce pas? Puisque vous parliez de plusieurs personnes." "Forgive me, sir. I believe you meant pathétiques in the plural, didn't you? Since you were speaking about multiple people." The air went still. Daniel's wineglass froze halfway to his lips. Jeff's fork stopped moving. Becky's smile collapsed like a sandcastle hit by a wave. Amara continued, her French flowing like silk over glass, flawless, effortless, devastatingly polite. "Et si je peux me permettre," she added, tilting her head slightly, "l'expression que vous cherchiez tout à l'heure, c'était probablement connaître sa place. Mais en France, on dit plutôt rester à sa place. C'est une nuance subtile, mais importante. And if I may, the expression you were looking for earlier was probably know one's place, but in France we say stay in one's place. It's a subtle nuance, but important." She smiled, warm, professional, utterly composed. Daniel's face drained of color. Grace's eyes widened, her hand covering her mouth. Jeff looked like he'd swallowed a stone. Amara let the silence breathe, let it settle over the table like fresh snow, cold and undeniable. Then she clasped her hands in front of her, the picture of service industry grace. "Souhaitez-vous que je décompte le Bordeaux maintenant, monsieur?" "Would you like the Bordeaux decanted now, sir?" The restaurant hummed around them, clinking glasses, soft laughter from other tables. But at table 7, there was nothing. No movement, no sound, just Daniel Moreau, frozen in his seat, staring at the woman he'd spent the last hour trying to humiliate, and realizing far too late that she'd understood every single word. The silence stretched like a wire about to snap. Daniel's mouth opened, closed, opened again. His brain scrambled for a foothold, for something clever, something dismissive, something that would restore the balance of power that had just shattered across his $400 Bordeaux. He forced a laugh, thin, brittle, desperately casual. "Well," he said in English, his voice too loud, "someone's been practicing." It landed like a rock in still water. Nobody laughed. Jeff stared at his plate like it held answers. Becky's face had gone pale beneath her makeup, her eyes darting between Daniel and Amara. Grace pressed her lips together, fighting something that looked dangerously close to a smile. At the next table, an elderly couple had stopped eating entirely, watching with the quiet fascination of people who knew they were witnessing something important. Because here's what Daniel didn't understand, what people like him never understood. Fluency doesn't announce itself with an accent. Intelligence doesn't arrive in a suit. And real power? Real power doesn't need to prove anything. Amara had spent 4 years at the Sorbonne. She'd written her thesis in French, dreamed in French, argued philosophy in Parisian cafes at 2 a.m. She spoke 3 languages fluently and was learning her 4th, but Daniel had seen a uniform and made his assumptions. He swallowed hard now, trying again. It was a joke, obviously. Bien sûr, Amara interrupted gently. Je comprends. Of course, I understand. But the way she said it, calm, pitying, final, made it clear she understood far more than he wanted her to. She turned to leave, her movements as graceful as when she'd arrived. Daniel's hand shot out, gripping the edge of the table. Wait. Amara paused, and every eye in the restaurant turned to see what the billionaire would do next. Daniel's jaw tightened. Anyone can memorize a few phrases, he said, his voice hardening into something sharp and defensive. Parroting isn't the same as understanding. Amara said nothing. She didn't need to, but Daniel couldn't leave it alone, couldn't let the moment pass, couldn't accept that the wall he'd built was crumbling brick by brick in front of everyone. He snapped his fingers, actually snapped them, toward the back of the restaurant. Manager, now! Within seconds, Marcus appeared, his expression carefully neutral, but his eyes tight with concern. He knew Daniel, knew his donation to the restaurant's opening gala, knew the kind of review he could write, the kind of calls he could make. Mr. Moreau, Marcus said smoothly, is there a problem? Your staff, Daniel said, gesturing vaguely at Amara without looking at her, needs better training in professional boundaries. The words hung there, ugly and transparent. Marcus opened his mouth, the apology already forming, the instinct to appease wealth overpowering everything else. But Grace's voice cut through first. She has a master's degree. Everyone turned. Grace set down her wineglass, her quiet eyes suddenly steady, suddenly sharp. From the Sorbonne, she continued, looking directly at Daniel. Amara worked as a French interpreter for the UN before moving here. I know because I hired her firm 3 years ago. The restaurant felt like it had run out of air. An older gentleman at the neighboring table leaned over, nodding. I remember. She translated at the International Commerce Summit. Flawless work. Daniel's face went from red to white to something grayish and hollow. Not evil, just small, exposed. Amara stood perfectly still, her expression unchanged, giving him nothing, no triumph, no anger, no satisfaction. Just the truth, standing in a uniform, looking back at him with quiet, devastating patience. Marcus cleared his throat. Perhaps, he said carefully, we should continue this conversation in my office? But Daniel was already standing, his chair scraping loud against marble, and everyone watched as Power realized it had nothing left to say. Daniel didn't wait for the check. He threw down his credit card like it was evidence he needed to bury, signed without looking, and stood abruptly. Jeff and Becky scrambled after him, their earlier laughter now a memory they wanted to forget. Daniel, wait, Jeff started, but Daniel was already moving toward the exit, his shoulders rigid, his expensive shoes clicking against marble like a retreat drum. The door closed behind them with a whisper. Grace remained. She sat alone at table 7 now, the abandoned wine glasses catching candlelight like tiny monuments to collapsed egos. She watched Amara move through the dining room, still professional, still composed, finishing her shift with the same quiet dignity she'd carried all night. When Amara brought the final bill, Grace was ready. She placed 5 crisp hundreds on the table, far more than the meal cost, and looked up, her eyes steady and sincere. Merci, she said softly. Pour la leçon, nous en avions tous besoin. Thank you, for the lesson. We all needed it. Amara's professional mask slipped just slightly. A flicker of recognition, of shared understanding between 2 women who knew exactly what had happened here. De rien, madame, she replied. You're welcome. Grace stood, smoothing her dress, and paused. He'll remember this, she said quietly, for the rest of his life. Amara smiled, Small, private, true. I know. Later, as the restaurant emptied and the chandeliers dimmed, Amara hung up her apron in the back room. Her shift was over, her feet ached, her hands smelled like lemon and wine. But she stood a little taller. That night, no one had raised their voice, no one had shouted, no weapons were drawn, no authority invoked, but everyone learned who truly belonged in the room, because respect costs nothing. And ignorance? Ignorance is always expensive.